Christianity is something that arises in a certain context, and really from the life of one person, Jesus of Nazareth. So before getting to his actual life, I want to say a few things about the context. There are two important things to understand about the background and the development of Christianity to appreciate what actually happens and why it was thought to have some significance. First of all, the world that Jesus was born into was Hellenistic. What do I mean by that? Well, it was overwhelmingly Greek. Alexander the Great, in 332 BC, had BC is when he died, so in that period, roughly 10 years up to that, had conquered a large area of the world, had conquered all the way from Greece through the Middle East, all the way up to the boundaries of India. Now, in doing that, he not only sort of brought conquering armies, but brought Greek culture, brought Greek language. And so there was a large empire there that was shaped by Greek thought, and in particular by a version of the Greek language. Now, in that region were people speaking all sorts of different languages, but the roads established by the Greeks, the sort of civilization, the government established and so on, gave people at least a working knowledge of a simplified version of Greek, known as Koine, a sort of common Greek, not quite pidgin Greek, but simpler than classical Greek. In any case, Hellenistic culture was overwhelmingly Greek. It's the reason that the New Testament is written in Greek. It was the sort of common language of the empire. Now, would everyone have known Greek? No, but educated people would have. And you might say that most business of the empire would have been conducted in Greek. Now, the Hellenistic worldview was, as I said, shaped by Greek thought, but Greek thought not as we find it in Plato or as in Aristotle, but as it developed out of their thought. After all, by this point, we're more than 300 years after Aristotle, and so there were a number of different schools, the Stoics, the Skeptics, the Epicureans, but they share a certain set of presuppositions, we might say. So let's take a look at three fundamental philosophical presuppositions. First of all, let's look at metaphysics. You might say that philosophy has three basic divisions: metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Metaphysics, the study of what there is. Epistemology, the theory of knowledge, of what we can know. And then ethics, what we ought to do. So, if we start with that categorization, we can understand the broad aspects, anyway, of a philosophical view by understanding its metaphysics, its view of what there is, its epistemology, how we know it, and then finally what we ought to do about it, its ethics. So let's take a look at what Hellenistic metaphysics tends to be like. Now, it varies from school to school and from thinker to thinker. I don't mean to suggest that there's any uniformity. Nevertheless, by the time of the birth of Jesus, there's a large consensus. And it is surprisingly modern. It is basically what we call today physicalism or materialism. The idea is that the world consists of material things. It consists of physical particles. And in fact, the Stoics have an elaborate theory of that, a sort of atomistic theory that in some ways is not very different from our own modern conception, except for all the equations, all the math, all the actual accurate predictions. The basic idea is the physical world consists of parts that are tiny, you might say, indivisible parts of which everything else is composed, and that's all there is. Okay? In particular, there's no soul, according to many of these views. There's just the physical world. The epistemology, it's empiricist. That is to say, as we saw last time, all concepts come from experience, all knowledge comes from experience. Okay, so everything that there is physical, it's around us. How do we interact with it causally? And we know about it through those causal interactions with the physical world. It's purely our experience of the physical world that gives us a basis for knowing anything. And then finally, what would you expect their ethics to look like if they are physicalists and also empiricists? What can you say about what we ought to do? Yeah, well, from one point of view, not much. And so the skeptics indeed think, yeah, there's not much you can say. But broadly speaking, people are naturalists, which means that ethical judgments, if they have any content at all, they have a naturalistic content. So if I say you ought to, for example, keep your promises, what am I really saying? I'm connecting that to something in the natural world. Now, keeping the promise, that's something we could perhaps characterize naturalistically. But what about the ought, the should, the normativity of this? When I say you ought to do this, the thought would be, well, I'm really saying something naturalistic, connecting the practice of promise keeping to something. To something, moreover, that we can know, something we can make sense of in terms of the physical world alone. Now, what could that be? What is it that you could say is an aspect of the physical world, is something that we are capable of knowing about through experience, and to which we can connect a practice like keeping promises? Yeah?
The stability of certain natural physical laws.
Well, the stability of physical laws, that's true, and indeed, causing great disruption or disorder would be a bad thing. I mean, presumably I can't, by breaking a promise, break a physical law. I can't sort of say, oh, I promise this will fall, and they think, haha, dope. Right? The law of gravity cannot be suspended by breaking a promise. But I might be able to disrupt a lot of things by breaking a promise. For example, saying, oh yes, I'll teach that course, and then never showing up. By the way, students sometimes have dreams that like there's an exam, and all of a sudden you're there, and you didn't know there was an exam that day, and you're unprepared. Professors have dreams like that too. I mean, but in our case, the dream is like, the chairman comes up to you in November, or if it's the spring semester, April, and says, you've been supposed to be teaching this course all semester. It's like, oh no! And I run to the room, of course, months later, after the class has started. Miraculously, all the students are just sitting there waiting. We've been sitting here all semester. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, there are things that cause disorders. That could be something, disorder, order. Those are things we might take as giving us some foundation for ethics. What else could serve in that role? Something that we could actually experience, something we could link to and produce values as a result of an experience. Are there things you experience that you think are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad? Yeah?
Pleasure and pain.
Good, pleasure and pain. So one way of doing this is to talk about pleasure and pain. And that's what the Epicureans do. They say, look, pleasure and pain are things we experience. And so we can clearly know about those. So if I say you shouldn't break your promises, what am I saying? I'm really linking that in some way to pleasure and pain. I'm basically saying you will bring about pain if you break promises. And so to the extent that this has content, it has a purely naturalistic content. Now we don't have to do it in terms of pleasure and pain, as we've seen. We could use order and disorder. Or, as the Stoics tend to, we could use peace of mind. Their goal is not pleasure so much as just tranquility, okay? Peace of mind, satisfaction, or what's another term? Contentment would be a good way of putting it. And so what's the opposite of contentment or tranquility? Peace of mind.
Restlessness, anxiety.
Yeah, anxiety, restlessness, nervousness, yeah, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's something too we could experience. Now, there are different ways of doing things then. If you're a Stoic, you focus on this. If you're an Epicurean, you focus on that. There are other schools that focus on this or some other aspect that they can characterize naturalistically. But that's the general idea. So this is the background of thought into which the Gospels take us, okay? The background assumptions tend to be these. And this is true across the entire sort of civilized world, all the way from Rome through Greece to the Middle East and all the way up to India. Now, by the way, some of these versions, like the stress on peace of mind, are actually pretty coherent with themes in Indian thought too. And one of the things that we tend to forget is that there was actually a fair amount of interaction. In the first century, there was an awareness of what was on the boundaries of the empire. There was trade, there was a lot of transportation, and in particular in the second century, we have early church fathers writing about Hinduism, about Buddhism. They're well aware of these other points of view. And so it's a mistake to think of the world that we find introduced in the New Testament as being this, I don't know, I sort of grew up thinking it was like this. Jesus was a carpenter in a small village. Okay? And, the larger world, it's sort of amazing that anybody else ever found out about any of this because this was in a tiny corner of Nowheresville. And it really isn't the case. This was a society where transportation, communication was quite advanced, where the intellectual culture was actually not very different from our own. In fact, I was giving a similar lecture saying, so one of the basic philosophical assumptions of the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century would look very much like this. And so it's in many ways much more modern than you might think. Okay, well that's an important part of the background. Hellenistic culture is something that shapes the world that Christianity is born into. And the second aspect of this is, I guess we could say, Rabbinical Judaism. Jesus is, after all, a rabbi. And he talks a lot about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Who were these people? And what is the background of thought? Now, we've already talked some about the conception of God in the Hebrew Bible. But it's important to realize that by this time, although the Hebrew scriptures were in Hebrew, that was not the common language of the people. The common language was, in the region Jesus was born in, Aramaic. Okay? Aramaic is to Hebrew roughly as contemporary English is to, let's say, medieval English, the language of Chaucer. Okay? So could someone just sit down and read the Hebrew scriptures without special training? Well, they would understand it about as well as you can understand Chaucer without any special training. Okay? You'd recognize a lot, but it would be difficult. It would be the kind of thing that you could not read well. And so what does that mean? For example, suppose nobody translated Chaucer into contemporary English. How many people would read it? Okay, how many people read it? But how many of you have actually read the Canterbury Tales? Some part of it. Okay, a fair number of you. Did you read it in medieval English? Okay, a few of you did. Right, but notice it's many fewer. About half the class has read some Chaucer, but only a tiny percentage has actually read the medieval version. It was like that here too. People could converse easily enough in Aramaic and so on, but the Hebrew scriptures, that was something that required special training. Now, the rabbis thought that actually that was not, you might say, a bug, but a feature. That was a good thing. There is a section of the Talmud, which is the recordings, transcribed, well, recordings. I don't want to put that in the modern context, so let me rephrase that. These are the sayings of the rabbis. The rabbis from roughly about 100 BC to maybe 200 AD in Palestine, and then in Babylon, once the temple falls and the Romans disperse the Jewish people. It's an oral tradition up to that point, but then it gets written down, and it gets written down in many, many volumes. Okay, so something that Christians tend to ignore, but I think that's quite important, is that that really characterizes the context in which Christianity arises. There's one section of that called the Ethics of the Fathers, which basically lays out ethical principles. And there are three ethical principles taken by the rabbis as fundamental. The first one is, be not hasty in judgment. Okay, be cautious. Things aren't always what they are. The second thing is, bring up disciples. And the third is, erect safeguards. Sometimes it's translated as ramparts. You know, put a fort around the law. Erect safeguards for the law. Now, how is that as a system of ethics? Is this directed at you, for example? Are they saying, you, be not hasty in judgment, bring up disciples, erect safeguards for the law? Who are these commandments for? Yeah.
Rabbis?
The rabbis, okay, exactly. These are commandments by rabbis for rabbis, okay? These are not commandments given to everyone. Now, one of the things that I think becomes an interesting issue in the interpretation of what Jesus says is, who's the audience? Is it his own disciples? Is it rabbis? Is it the leaders, in other words? Are these commands to everyone? In some cases, I think it's one. In some cases, the other. But we shouldn't assume that all the pronouncements are actually directed at a universal audience. These, for example, are very clearly commandments by rabbis to rabbis. Now, what's the significance of them? Well, be not hasty in judgment. What does that tell you? Yeah.
It comes from, actually, if you're looking at apocryphal scriptures, it comes from the Book of Wisdom, which is part of the virtue of prudence.
Ah, okay, good. There is a wisdom literature that goes along with this, found, for example, in Ecclesiastes, or in Proverbs, or in other places, in some of the writings of the prophets. And there's all sorts of advice there, but among the key bits of advice is prudence, okay? This is what will get you into trouble, this is what won't. Now, is it always obvious? No. The idea behind Rabbinical Judaism is that it's often very hard to tell. Things are not as they appear. The surfaces are not good indicators. And so that's why you should be not hasty in judgment. To be prudent, to be wise, that's a difficult thing. It requires a lot of training. Now, there tend to be two attitudes about wisdom in the Western tradition, broadly speaking. One is, and really globally, one is it's something that requires a great deal of work, a great deal of training, a great deal of education. You have to look behind the surface of things to understand the deeper significance. But the other is, no, we're all born wise, and we just have to recover that wisdom and not let other things cloud it. And so we find here in Rabbinical Judaism that idea that is found in Aristotle, for example, in the Western tradition. This is a lot of work. Being wise is very difficult. Kant has the opposite view in the Western tradition. No, being wise and being a good person, that's easy. Everybody knows how to do it by the time they're in kindergarten. All you have to do is remember. Okay? And so they're committed to that view. Wisdom is hard. The second view, bring up disciples. What's the point of that?
Multiplication.
Okay, partly spreading this, yes, multiplying those who actually know and can exercise proper judgment, spreading wisdom. Yes?
The responsibility, social responsibility.
Good, the social responsibility of the rabbi. Think about the difficulty here. And it's a sort of problem faced by the founders of this country. It's a problem faced by a lot of people historically. You want to establish something and preserve it. How do you preserve it? Now, for a while, you can be in charge of it, right? You can think, well, I can preserve it. But I'm not talking about something to be preserved during a year or a decade or a lifetime. Something that you want to design to be preserved for thousands of years. How can you possibly do that? You have this idea. You want to establish a religion or an institution or a form of government. You want it to persist for thousands of years. How can you protect it? Well, one thing, if you've got some principles on which it rests, you better bring up disciples. You better teach people those principles, right? You better pass that along. If you don't pass it on, it dies. Any civilization is sort of one generation away from collapse. Because if it's not passed on, its principles, if the knowledge and wisdom it embodies are not passed on, it falls apart. So one aspect of this is, look, pass it on. Pass on the wisdom. Pass on the civilization, this set of institutions. But now 3, erect safeguards against the law. That's part of the same project too. Have you ever played a game of telephone where one person says something and you pass it along? Sometimes it actually comes out identical to the starting point, but sometimes it comes out radically different. Now, the same thing can happen over thousands of years as you pass on a set of ideas. So what do you do to try to make sure that these institutions, these ideas, will not be corrupted? Yeah.
In some ways, you have to centralize, because you have to narrow the channel, you have to narrow who has the seat of authority. For example, in Catholicism, it would be with infallibility. To be able to have one spokesman that would be able to preserve the tradition.
Good. So let's think about strategies, right, for safeguarding a tradition this time. And by the way, in Rabbinical Judaism, there's a tremendous stress on tradition. And it persists in Judaism to this day. Think about Fiddler on the Roof, the opening song, tradition, okay? Now, why is it so important? Well, look, that's what has to be preserved. You have to pass this along. And how do you do it? All right, you've mentioned one strategy, centralization. And indeed, that's part of Rabbinical Judaism. You want to centralize this, now not in one person. So it's not quite the conception that you find in Catholicism, where you have one person who is the inheritor of the tradition and has the responsibility for passing it on to the next. But there's a small group, okay? So it's more like an oligarchy. But the idea is, look, you're a rabbi, you have to bring up disciples, so there are other rabbis to pass this along to. But you also have to protect it. It will be corrupted if people half understand it. So you have to make sure people really understand it. Hence, keep it in Hebrew. Make them learn Hebrew. Make them study this for years. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Okay? So protect, and by the way, this is why women were not allowed to study Torah. Women are going to corrupt you, okay? Yeah, I mean, women, they understand anything. That's the idea. That's pretty obnoxious, perhaps, but the idea is, look, some people are going to mess it up. Now, I assume they were wrong about the fact that women couldn't understand this, but the thought is, look, this is hard. That goes back to the first point. Wisdom is hard, and not everybody can do this. So you want to not just toss the ideas out there and see what happens. You want to preserve this for people who actually are capable of understanding. And then, of course, there were lots of rather obnoxious assumptions about who that might be, but the thought is, I think, intelligible apart from those obnoxious assumptions. Okay, centralization is one strategy. What else can you do to try to preserve a tradition? And after all, it's a complicated tradition. In the Torah, there are 613 commandments. There are 10 famous ones, but there are 603 other ones. And a lot of them are very detailed. Okay, so it's not easy. It's not like you can say, okay, to your kindergarten class, I'll teach you the basic commands of the Torah. No, it's a complicated body of law. And by the time the rabbis are on the scene, there's a whole body of canon law that goes to interpret this and supplement. That's why the Talmud takes many, many volumes. So it's a long, complicated thing. What can you do to try to preserve all of that? Yeah.
Expansion of the law. You see Jesus basically erecting safeguards for the law, and so instead of saying, simply don't do this, he put up boundaries around it. So I guess if we take Genesis, for example, the eating of the fruit from the tree, okay, well, you're not allowed to go within 10 feet of the tree. Had they expanded the law a little bit, you erect more safeguards around it so the law itself isn't broken. Jesus does that with the disciples.
Okay, good. Yeah, define certain boundaries, which are not exactly maybe the ones in the law. You might think these are approximations to law, or as you put it, expansions. The idea is, look, yeah, there's no law against what I'm about to say particularly, but I'll tell you, if you start doing this, you're going to be led astray. So sort of create a fence that's a little simpler, easier to understand, but broader than the law itself. So for example, you're giving advice to somebody. Let's say there's this young teenager, 13-year-old, comes up to you and says, "You're so much older and so much wiser. Give me good advice for being, going through my teenage years." That's really stupid. What would you say? Like, for example, who should I hang out with? There are lots of people at my school. I don't know who to be friends with. I'm new to this school. Who should I try to make friends with? What would you tell them? Gosh, you're useless. I won't send people to you for advice. Yeah.
Well, if you do maybe want him, her to what you believe to drink a lot, maybe you would say maybe not hang out with people who drink a lot, or be attracted to those circles of friends.
Exactly. Okay, so you don't want your child to grow up an alcoholic. Maybe you've got alcoholism in the family, and so you especially want that. No, you could say, drink in moderation and find other friends who drink in moderation. But maybe you say, look, stay away from alcohol altogether. Right? Don't hang out with people who drink. Don't drink yourself, and so on. Is that really required? Well, maybe not. But the thought is, it's a boundary that will keep you from getting into trouble. It's not as if one drink is going to be a big trouble, or hanging out with somebody who takes a drink now and then is a big problem. It's just that if you don't observe that boundary, it gets much harder to judge where the boundary is. And so we can do that kind of thing, to set more intelligible boundaries that are somewhat broader, that expand the region, and make it easier to convey what will get you into trouble. What are some other things we might do?
This might sound kind of silly, but you also want to be strict in preserving the meaning of the language that's used to express the law. Because if the language itself changes, then you interpret it differently.
Exactly right. We want to be very careful about preserving the language, preserving the original meaning, which is why the rabbis were not enthusiastic on any project to actually translate, for example, the Hebrew scriptures into Aramaic. No, don't do that. Because we want to preserve the original language and the original meanings. Okay? In constitutional law, this is something like the doctrine of originalism. Don't just make it up and figure out what it might mean to us today. Go back to the founders and figure out what they meant. What did that language mean at the time of the founders? Don't just ask, what does the pursuit of happiness mean to us? Think, what did the pursuit of happiness mean specifically when it was in William Blackstone? And so forth. Try to preserve that original meaning. Are there other strategies? Yeah.
Resisting innovation
religion is something to be suspicious of. Okay? And indeed, at the end of the gospel, what happens to Jesus? He's executed, right? Partly because he represents some kind of change. And all change is dangerous from this point of view. All change threatens to disrupt the original meaning and so get you into trouble. What else could you do? I'm trying to teach people to obey the 613 commandments, right? And that's hard, complicated. What could I do? Yeah.
You can say lead by example.
Oh, well, all right, good. Lead by example. Absolutely right. A lot of people are going to be led not by the explicit teaching, but by the way you live. What is Jesus' main complaint against the Pharisees? It's actually not against the theory for the most part, although the relevance of this I think he disagrees with. It's they don't lead by example. Okay, they aren't really getting at the essence of the law. They aren't living by their own principles. What else could you do? Yeah.
Find ways of enforcing it.
Okay, good. Have enforcement mechanisms. So enforcing the tradition. And sometimes that's going to feel harsh, right? Because you're going to say, wait, you violated commandment number 587. You're in big trouble. But who cares, right? I mean, gosh, I'm doing it right now. My pants have both cloth and metal. They have a zipper. Oh, that violates one of the commandments. Okay? And we might say, whoa, you're now in deep trouble. We said, look, who cares? But from one point of view, you can say, look, here's why you care. Because you've got to respect the tradition. And if you vary in small ways from the tradition, it's going to be easier to vary in large ways. So this can mean, look, enforce the tradition even in the details. Yes?
You can basically cut the fat off of the tradition by separating essential universal principles from specific contextual principles. For example, when he said, not one jot or definition of the law, he meant that, but he also says, from the spirit of the law, which is he consolidated.
Excellent. Yes, precisely. I'm going to put that as axiomatized. But that's sort of misleading. You're absolutely right. Identify the essential principles. Basically say, look, I don't care if you really follow the rules about pants, or the rules about this or that other thing. That's not what's essential. What's essential is this. Now, almost every religious tradition, almost all, do this at some point. They may have many rules, but they say at some point, here are the 5 fundamental precepts. Here are the 10 commandments. Or in the summary of the law, here's the essence. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? Notice, love God, that's the vertical commandment. Love your neighbor, that's the horizontal commandment. But that's something that is meant to capture the essence of this. All the rest is easier. And so, indeed, what do we do in, for example, a society like our own, in trying to preserve institutions? We have a constitution, and that gives the essential principles. Then, of course, there's a huge body of law that gives lots of other rules, but we separate out the essence and say, this is essential. Yeah.
This one seems obvious, and it's kind of in preserving language, but just write it down.
Good, write it down. And indeed, this was an oral tradition until the Romans destroyed the temple. And then it gets written down. Why? Because if you're all gathered in one place, everybody's there in Jerusalem, and you can bring people in, then you can basically establish all of this, pass on the knowledge within that set of institutions. But if now you're driven and dispersed, wow, you better write it down, because there's no longer one place. It's not like you can say, we'll meet every Monday morning and talk about the law. All of a sudden, you need another more enduring mechanism. And so that's something that is sort of obvious to us today, because we do that all the time. But in a culture where much more was done as part of the oral tradition, that's a huge step. We've got to write it down. Okay, now, it's in this context that Jesus is born. And in some ways, yeah, what are the basic facts? Let's go back here and erase the Hellenistic stuff, but don't erase it from your mind. The facts of Jesus' life are in some ways, well, pretty unremarkable. When was he born? Nobody knows exactly. The traditional date is, of course, the year 1. There's no year 0. But okay, I guess traditionally December 21st, 1. Okay? And then, when did he die? Well, traditionally, 33. Now, people have disputed this. What's actually found in the Gospels is somewhat hard to interpret. He is described in one place as having been born under the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC. But on the other hand, Herod the Great was succeeded by Herod Antipas, who has a very similar name. It's also described in Luke that this was during the enrollment when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Quirinius assumed the governorship of Syria in 6 AD, and so both can't be right. On the other hand, you have reference at Jesus' birth to the star of Bethlehem, and then later to various astronomical events at the event of his crucifixion. We can calculate when those astronomical events occurred, and that would put the date of his death, indeed, at April 3rd, 33. So if those things, so anyway, maybe the traditional account here is right, but modern scholars debate this kind of stuff. Anyway, that's the general idea. Well, what happened? We know nothing from these gospel accounts about his childhood or early adulthood. We come on the scene when he's 30 years old, and that's when he starts his ministry. Up until that point, he is presumably a carpenter, and his father was a carpenter. Incidentally, in Nazareth, there was a large Roman development on the coast that would not have been so far away. This might have been a very good trade at the time. In any event, he begins his ministry. And what are some of the main features of the ministry as is depicted in, for example, the Gospel of Mark? The reason I had you read Mark, by the way, is that it's the shortest Gospel and the one that doesn't really have an axiom on it. It basically just says, here are the basic facts. Matthew is trying to stress continuity with the Hebrew tradition. Luke is trying to stress the universality of the message. John is filled with all sorts of metaphysical assumptions. We'll study it later, but it's highly philosophical. Mark is just saying, here's the deal. Okay? So it's a basic account of the events. Now, before we actually get into the details, when were these things written? There are two versions of this. There's the traditional account and then what modern scholars tend to think about this. In my view, in saying the traditional and the modern, I don't mean to suppose that one or the other is correct. It seems to me the arguments of the modern scholars are often incredibly thin. They might be right, but they're not very compelling. In any event, the traditional view is that the Gospels are the earliest Christian writings. They were written during the 40s. If Jesus died around 33, then they would have been written roughly 10 to 20 years after his death. The more modern version says basically, well, it's just like the time. These things were written down around 70 or shortly thereafter, at least the Synoptic Gospels were, after the Romans had destroyed the temple and people were forced to disperse. Okay? So that would still be within, somewhat less than 40 years after Jesus' death. So either way, within the lifetimes of the people who had actually experienced these things. Now, what are the major events of Jesus' ministry?
Healing, you think?
Okay, good. There are all sorts of accounts of miracles. And most of those do involve healing. Healing the sick, blind man, the lame person, and the lepers, and so on. There are other miracles as well that don't involve healing. What are some of the others? Yeah, later. But that's an important one.
Water to wine.
Good, water into wine, the very first miracle.
Dispelling evil spirits.
Yeah, casting out spirits. What else?
Feeding the 5,000.
Good, feeding the 5,000. Yeah.
Does the tongues thing count? Speaking in tongues?
Oh, well, I'm just thinking of Jesus' life. So then we have the Acts of the Apostles later, so that's, but right. There are later miracles that he commissions his followers to perform, and that we have accounts of later. So interestingly, this ability gets transferred at a certain stage. But we'll look at that later. There's one more important one that we've left out.
Resurrection.
Good. It raises people from the dead. Now the accounts, notice, tend to start small, the water and the wine and so forth, and then get bigger and bigger until we get raising from the dead. Okay, so that's one thing that's a major feature. Now notice this is really unusual. There are a lot of aspects of Jesus as the beginner of the Christian tradition that are reminiscent of the beginners of other traditions. I mean, he has a lot in common with the Buddha, or with Socrates, or with Confucius, or with Lao Tzu. For example, he has some students, has some followers, disciples and so on, but never writes anything down. It's his followers who write things down. He is unusually wise. Houston Smith, in his book on the world's religion, says there are really only two people in the history of the world who made people not say, who is that? What is that? Jesus and the Buddha. And so there's something remarkable that people experience on the spot. But this person himself doesn't actually write anything down and so on. So in those ways, he said, but we don't have similar miracle accounts about these. Nobody says, Confucius brought me back from the dead, okay, or the Buddha healed me, and so on. So this is really unique. This is something not found in other places. For a while, it was popular for biblical historians to say, oh, well, everybody at the time was claimed to be doing these kinds of miracles. The most prominent example of that turned out to be a forgery. So actually, no, nobody else was claimed to do all this kind of stuff. What are some other features of the gospel accounts of his ministry? Yeah?
Proclaiming the coming of the kingdom of God.
Ah, okay, good. Proclaiming the coming of the kingdom of God. Many of these statements, parables, and other things are talking about, yes, the kingdom of God. Now, what does that mean? It's not entirely clear, and so people debate that. Incidentally, part of the reason that scholars today tend to think the Gospel accounts were written after 70 is that there are certain things that prophesy doom, and they think, well, people wouldn't have written them down unless the temple had already fallen and it's already been fulfilled. I mean, part of the reason I find that a thin argument is, look, the people who were writing this down were followers, believers, right? They weren't going to say, well, it said this would happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Someone wrote that down. They were believers. They were going to write it down whether it happened yet or not. But moreover, he's part of a prophetic tradition here. And the prophets are always saying doom is around the corner, right? Or in this case, perhaps glory is around the corner. In any case, they're always predicting big events, so that's not like this is a shocking thing that nobody else is saying. In any event, the kingdom of God is something that is an important concept that is introduced here and that's hard to really fully understand. What are some other aspects of the ministry? Yeah.
He claims a certain authority that's beyond the mere teaching tradition. He claims to receive Moses, and he uses the ineffable name, which means that's one of the reasons he gets into trouble with the Rabbinical Context.
Good. He claims divine authority. Okay, and that is indeed part of what gets him in trouble. It's one thing to say, here's what I think God means. It's another thing to say, here's what God means. I know. Okay, because I am myself divine. Or, now here it's complicated, because we find, yes, the claims to authority, but also we have what scholars have referred to as the messianic secret. He does not generally have people talk about this. In fact, when in the Transfiguration, he tells the disciples, shh, don't tell people. Several will say, we got to build a monument here, build a monument, one, for you and for Moses and for Elijah. He said, no, don't tell people what happened here. And he says the same thing when he brings the young girl back from the dead. He swears people to secrecy. He says, don't tell people what happened. And so he keeps this a secret for a long time, revealing it only to the innermost circle of the disciples. But eventually, the rest of the disciples figure this out, and then the word gets out in general. But there is this claim to divine authority that goes far beyond anything the rabbis would dare to claim. Now, what else is a feature of this ministry?
teachings.
Okay, good, the teachings. And what form do they take?
Parables.
Exactly, parables. Now that's unusual. Again, if we think about the beginners of great religious traditions, what do we find Confucius doing? He makes proclamations, right? He says, actually right at the beginning of the Analects, isn't it wonderful to have friends coming from far away? Okay? And other things that are sort of more direct advice. The master said, you know, shoot, I don't know, I think this is I draw a complete blank. Well, yeah, okay, the superior person is generous, is kind, is serious, and so on, giving you virtues, giving you moral instruction. The Buddha gives you 4 noble truths, okay, that life is suffering, that desire is the cause of suffering, and so on. But now, Jesus tends not to do that. There are some places where he does. There is a summary of the law, which is not an innovation, it's something that is part of the Talmudic tradition. But what really is an innovation are the parables. He tells people stories, okay? So he doesn't primarily engage in moral instruction by actually giving moral commands, or even by talking about virtues. He instead tells stories, okay? And these stories are often, well, they're always short, right? They're always simple. They're not about particular people. He's not saying, listen, let me tell you about my uncle, or about, remember King so-and-so. Confucius often says, the great kings of the past, Yao and Shun, here's what they did. Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't talk about particular figures. He doesn't say, well, let me tell you a story about Moses or Elijah or anything of that sort. Let me tell you about, someone working in a vineyard, blah, blah, blah. And so it's always sort of this abstract story form. Now, some of these are very famous. What are some of the famous ones?
Parables.
Okay, good. The prodigal son is one of the most famous. The son who leaves to seek his own way in the world, comes to disaster, and then comes back and is forgiven by his father.
Yeah, parable of the shrewd servant.
The shrewd, well, I don't know if that's that famous, but okay. The shrewd servant. I was hoping you'd say the good Samaritan.
Parable of the sower.
The parable of the sower. Very good. And the list goes on and on. I don't intend to list them all here. But now notice some of those make very direct moral points, like the Good Samaritan, right? Or in a sense like the prodigal son story. The story of the Good Samaritan, it's really an answer to a question, well, who is my neighbor? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is my neighbor? This story is meant to suggest, well, anyone, right? The prodigal son is both about the son's sort of returning to the fold, but also the father's forgiveness. And to some extent about the older brother's annoyance with all of that. As an older brother, I've always related especially to that one. But in any case, that's something that is a very different way of conveying a sort of moral message from those found in other religious traditions. Anything else distinctive about the ministry?
Confrontation.
Yeah, confrontation.
Specifically with the Pharisees and the Sadducees of the day. It kind
Okay.
of follows in John the Baptist tradition that called them a brood of vipers.
Okay, good. Yes, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they are the two main groups of rabbis who were part of that rabbinical tradition that I was outlining. Oh yeah, some of you can't read this in the back, I'll put it over here. And who were they? Well, the Pharisees were basically the canon lawyers. They were the ones who had the responsibility for passing on the tradition. And they were the ones who most stressed the things I wrote on this blackboard, that is to say, stressing the things that were distinct in the Hebraic tradition. The Sadducees were those who were much more Hellenized, who were the physicalists, who were the naturalists, who were the empiricists, who tried to reconcile the message of the Hebrew scriptures with a modern worldview from their point of view. The Pharisees were trying to stick to the tradition. They viewed the Sadducees as people who were really corrupting it. The Sadducees thought that material success was a sign of virtue. After all, virtue, wisdom was all about gaining happiness and peace of mind and all of that. And so to the extent that you gain happiness and prosperity and peace of mind, you must be a good person. And so they thought of those kinds of things both happiness and also its material accompaniments as things that were signs of virtue. The Pharisees thought that was ridiculous. No, it's really an internal matter. And then, of course, there were different schools among the Pharisees as well. Here, I'll write this up here. So the Pharisees were the ones who were trying to be faithful to the Judaic tradition. The Sadducees, I'm spelling this were the ones who were more Hellenized. Now, Jesus does indeed reject both. And I want us to end today by thinking, why does he reject it? Now, the Sadducees, I think it's obvious. He's rebelling against this Hellenized view. Okay, he doesn't accept that view at all. But what's wrong with the Pharisees? Now, part of it is he calls them hypocrites. He thinks they're not living up to their own words. But are there places where he disagrees with that rabbinical tradition? Because certainly there is a confrontation. He is, in part, representing change. Now, some people have said, look, he's really a rabbi in the school of Hillel. And to some extent, there's a lot of parallel between the things Jesus says and the various sayings in the Gospels. One of the rabbis that is represented in the Talmud is Gamaliel, who is referred to in the New Testament, and who is in some ways friendly, questioning, but nevertheless friendly to Jesus. And so it's not as if he rejects this entire tradition, but there are certain elements, I think, that come through very clearly as at least being reinterpreted by Jesus. What did I put up there? You would think is most questionable from the point of view that emerges in Mark's Gospel. Well, look at it this way. We talked about expanding the law. We talked about erecting safeguards around the law. What did that mean? Well, among other things, it meant, look, hang out with other people who will not corrupt your virtue. One of the things that the rabbis are always saying is, look, avoid temptation. Do not place yourself in any circumstance that might corrupt you. Do not have faith in your own moral rectitude. Be morally humble. Recognize that you are morally vulnerable. So protect yourself. It's partly protect the law, but partly, erect a fortress around you so that you are not corrupted by the corrupting influences of the culture and other people. What does Jesus do? Does he live as a hermit? Do he and his disciples go off into a community like the Essenes where they live in isolation? Now, who does he eat with?
Prostitutes.
Prostitutes. Tax collectors. I mean, I don't know what they were the representatives of this foreign oppressive government, right? Maybe an equivalent today is spies. Or maybe people who work for the State Department. I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I mean, he hangs out with sort of the dregs of society. Anybody talking to an adolescent, would you say, well, here's what I want you to do. Go out and hang out with prostitutes. Hang out with drug dealers. That's the deal, man. I mean, that's the way no, you'd say, of course not. No parent would give their children that advice. And the rabbis would tell people, look, don't hang out with those bad people. You'll be corrupt. Jesus hangs out, and he encourages his followers to minister. And so he has a radically different idea of who the law is for and what it means to erect safeguards around it. He wants to open it up. He wants to throw open the gates and say the law is for everyone. And that's certainly not the view of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who have it carefully guarded and have themselves carefully guarded. Well, next week we'll start talking about the beginnings of the Christian tradition as it develops from this foundation.